Okay, let's talk about essential questions and designing curriculum from essential questions. And I like to use essential questions versus objectives for designing curriculum. Now, I'm not saying that objectives are not important or needed. They are absolutely essential for lesson planning. But objectives are used by the teacher and they can be hard for students to understand, especially if they have a lot of terminology in them. So then they just become kind of meaningless or even authoritative. Now, others will disagree with me on this and say that you should share the objectives with the student. I think the essential questions invite the students into inquiry, create the foundation for the possibility of more student-centered classroom, and of course, that also depends totally on the rest of what you design for the curriculum and how you create the culture for your classroom with your students. That's why I prefer starting with essential questions. Let's talk about the pyramid then that's in the book of the different essential question types. So at the bottom, you have the big idea questions, which frame the course. This is really big picture and may not be that usable in elementary classrooms, though it certainly could be. You could frame your whole year around a big question or a goal. But it's a lot easier at the secondary level to create big idea questions for a specific course. For example, in a biology course I've taught, we used, what is my role in the biosphere? Now, looking back at that now, it's not that interesting or intriguing of a question, but it is a big concept. It is a big idea. We actually had the students answer that question a little bit differently at the end of the course, asking them, so then, from what you've learned as a biologist, how out you live in the world? This is a much more open-ended and intriguing and inviting question. You could even cut off the end of the question and make it more interdisciplinary. The next level is the thematic question. These frame a unit. So how do I participate in the flow of matter and energy in an ecosystem? In the biology course I taught, we had 6 units, so 6 thematic questions. Most of our planning and the planning exercises in the book, I'll have you start at this level with the thematic question and work our way up the pyramid. It's a bit easier to get your arms around the thematic question than the big idea question. You only have one of these per unit. And the next level is a sub-thematic question. You might not even have these. These are breaking the thematic down. So in my example, one is, in what ways do you participate in cycling of energy? You need at least 2 of these. If you only have one, then there's no point to it because the idea of the sub-thematic is that it is breaking down the theme into smaller chunks to be accessible. So you can think of a thematic question as what you're going to assess with the big summative assessment at the end, and a sub-thematic question might be assessed with what might be equivalent to a quiz in scope of content. And then we have our guiding question. And the guiding question in my example, how does an ecosystem capture the sun's energy? So you need at least 2 guiding questions per sub-thematic or thematic question if skipping over the sub-thematic question. Or again, what's the point? The idea of the guiding question is to further break down the scope of the content into manageable chunks that you can address in a lesson or two or 3. They are therefore more topical and focused on a specific topic, as in this case with a question about photosynthesis. Leading questions are actually below the level of planning curriculum, and leading questions are maybe questions that would be within a lesson plan. So what is the equation for photosynthesis? They tend to look more like quiz questions, possibly. And then a hook question is just a hook that is used to get the student's attention, to get them thinking about something. It might be the same as the guiding question, depending on how the guiding question is written and how inviting it is. Or it could be something that is maybe more intriguing, and like, what if all the plants suddenly died? So you get the questions thinking about the role of plants and then go from there. So you might have multiple leading and hook questions in a lesson, or you might not have any depending on the design of the lesson. But those bottom 4 are what frame the scope and sequence of a unit. So let's look at this from another angle. So we'll start with kind of an outline format. We'll start with the big idea question. You have one of these per year or course. And then you break that into thematic questions, one per each unit. So if I have 6 units, I'll have 6 thematic questions throughout the year. And then each thematic question might be broken down into 2 or more sub-thematic questions if it's big and broad enough. Most of the time, I find that teachers writing elementary units do not use sub-thematic questions, as their units are often not that long and broad in scope. However, the more interdisciplinary the unit, the more likely the unit will be longer and require sub-thematic questions to provide the structure you and the students will need to keep track of what you're learning. We'll just take one sub-thematic further, otherwise my screen will get too full and messy. So sub-thematic question 1 might have 3 guiding questions. So it would be guiding question 1.1, guiding question 1.2, guiding question 1.3. In my other half of the unit, maybe I'll have 4 of them. So guiding question 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4. So this is our scope and sequence for the unit. From there, you would develop 1 or more lesson plans for each guiding question, and within that is where you would find the leading and the hook questions. So this part here, those questions outline your unit. And I have found that once you start thinking in essential questions as your way of outlining a unit of study, it's really hard to go back and to not think in terms of questions, because you are getting so that you are thinking in inquiry. This process is the topic of Chapter 8 in the book. It will walk you through this entire process step by step of how to outline a unit based on questions. And then the process of developing the actual lesson plans for each day of teaching is the topic of Chapters 9 and 10.